Okay, so hello everybody. I'm Tom Christensen. I am the director of the China the World program here at Columbia University. And this is the last edition of our speaker series, correct, Daniel? This is the last one for the semester. It is my tradition and the last talk of the speaker series for this semester and for the academic year to thank Daniel Sahensky for his excellent work in putting this series together. Without Daniel, the entire program would not run, and we are in his debt. And today we have a special speaker because he's one of our own. In two senses, he's one of our own. Justin Canfil is one of our own because he recently was granted a PhD in political science here at Columbia University, the same department that gave me a PhD a very long time ago. So he is one of our own in that sense. But more important for our event today, he is one of our own because he's one of our postdoctoral fellows for 2021 to 2022. And he is working on a project that he will present today. And it's a project that brings in a lot of different fields. It brings in international security, it brings in international law, and it brings in international politics into a very interesting thesis about technological contestation in international law and arms control. And these topics are going to become increasingly important, in my opinion, because of China's fast-paced military modernization and its fast-paced nuclear modernization in combination, where China is much more likely to be discussed as a key participant in any future arms control agreements. So understanding how arms control works and how technological innovation interacts with arms control will become even more important than it has been in the past during the Cold War, in the future, in my opinion. And I think Justin really has his finger on the pulse of a very important security issue moving forward. In addition to getting his PhD at Columbia University and being a China in the World Fellow, Justin is also a fellow at Tufts Fletcher's cybersecurity program at present, and he's been funded by various organizations, including the NSF, Fulbright, the U.S. Department of State, and the Department of Education for his research. So he's been a very successful scholar already, and we look forward to great things from him in the future. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the session over to Justin to present his talk, and we'll come back in the question and answer period. If you want to post questions and answer, we ask you to use the Q&A function, not the chat function. If you want to chat with other people in the group, you can use the chat function, but we'll be looking for your questions at the end of the talk in the Q&A function. Thanks a lot, and over to you, Justin.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Tom. Daniel, do you think I could get privileges to share my screen? So I have some slides. Okay, great. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that, right? Okay, well, yeah, so thanks so much for having me. And that's a really kind introduction, Tom. I often came to C&WP events when I was a grad student. And so now to be here speaking to you as a fellow is really a privilege for me. So in general, my research agenda is focused on how emerging technologies are impacting the ability of the US and China to cooperate on international law and arms control. And the slice I'm going to present today is just one small part of a wider book project I'm working on that examines how the two sides manage technological controversies using legal and diplomatic tools, kind of short of arms racing. And so let me tell you about what this talk is not going to be. It's not going to be a talk on China's approach to international law and arms control. I was hoping to share some findings on that with you today, but they're not quite ready. And so instead, what it is going to cover is how some of these issues work in general. And the purpose was going to be to shed some light on kind of the US's approach to China. And in particular, the goal of the talk is going to be to explain why contestation between the US and China about which technologies are fair game isn't completely unrestricted. So what I mean is, even though relations have basically hit a 50-year low, not everything between the US and China is controversial. And I think that's kind of interesting. So probably all of you saw the news last fall that China tested a hypersonic version of what's called a fractional orbital bombardment system. Beijing quickly denied this, but essentially what such a weapon would do is sends a nuclear weapon into temporary Earth orbit, and then it deorbits directly above a target. And so there's a lot of debate over how dangerous this actually is. But on the US side, we see the Department of Defense ringing alarm bells, claiming to have been blindsided. And you have people like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, who've called it a Sputnik moment. But the weird thing here is that the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 ostensibly bans nuclear weapons in space. And China isn't involved in as much arms control as the US is, but it is a party to that treaty. So since the US has basically painted China as a scofflaw for years now, and has no plans of developing its own system like this, why hasn't the US government seized this opportunity to call China's compliance with international law into question? So the usual explanation is that law and arms control are basically no match for the rapid pace of technological change. And if you open any newspaper on any given day, you're likely to read something along those lines. And now traditionally, the way states manage the risk and uncertainty of arms racing is through binding agreements about what is or isn't allowed. But when it comes to many 21st century technologies, things often seem to be sort of slow going. And so the images you see here are from fieldwork that I conducted in 2018, when I went to several countries and I shadowed negotiators at these multilateral conferences where they were debating kind of rules of the road for cyber conflict and AI and other sorts of emerging technologies. And what I saw there really drove home for me that it's often lawyers and diplomats who are on the front lines of this process. And often they have remarkably little technical expertise. And so we might be tempted to take this as kind of more face value evidence of this old trope that law and arms control just can't keep up. And there was just an unfortunate example of this last year, I think it's worth mentioning. So you may remember how Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned by a new military-grade nerve agent called Novichok. And the first time Novichok's existence came to light, questions were immediately raised about whether it's even technically illegal under the 1997 Chemical Weapons Convention, which has long been hailed by the international community as this landmark achievement of international law and arms control, because it's so detailed and comprehensive. It's something like 200 pages long. It took decades to negotiate, and it comes with this exhaustive list of what counts as a chemical weapon. But because Novichok agents actually use a different family of chemical precursors, they weren't on this list already. And so states had to convene for this emergency vote to formally update the treaty to include it. So the fact that something as hideous as Novichok was technically exempted from such a detailed legal regime, to many has suggested that existing law really is just hopelessly retrospective, because as soon as the ink is dry on one of these things, someone's just going to invent new ways to get around it. Now, if we contrast this with other cases, though, a puzzle starts to emerge. So in the beginning of American involvement in the Vietnam War, US troops were found to be using a new kind of supercharged tear gas. And when news broke that the US was doing this, it was immediately accused of violating the Geneva Protocol by using chemical weapons on the battlefield. But this is kind of weird because the Geneva Protocol was written in 1925, and this is half a century before these events. Nothing in it actually says anything about tear gas. And in fact, the entire protocol is only half a page long, most of it in the preamble. So, however reprehensible the US's actions were in this case, you'd think that non-lethal tear gas is at least more consistent with international humanitarian law than lethal alternatives like Novichok, right? But condemnation of the US's activity at the time was hardly less than condemnation we see about Russia's activity in the Novichok case. So, for political scientists like me, this raises an interesting question. Why does this 50-year-old law, based on only 350 words of text, negotiated basically by a bunch of mustachioed aristocrats in a smoky room, seem to hold up at least as well, if not better, than this exquisitely detailed 200-page convention that was negotiated in consultation with scientists? So, in my dissertation and now in my book project, this question has sort of motivated, this idea that we need a new theory to explain what gives law its staying power. So all laws might eventually become obsolete due to technological change, but why do some laws seem to last longer than others? And why doesn't all the time and energy governments put into making these highly elaborate institutionalized agreements really seem to give us much purchase on technology? Now, our best theories presume that specificity in these agreements means better compliance. And this has been a pretty good model. In fact, it's been a great model for a lot of what we try to do. But as I'll argue in the rest of the talk, it's actually empirically false. And by the same token, we often hear from politicians and from pundits that law of any kind is fated to lag behind. So how it's written doesn't really matter. But this isn't true either, as I'll show. The problem is that these two literatures, law on the one hand and technology on the other, haven't done enough to really speak to each other. And so I'm going to argue that law can keep up with technology, but that specificity, which is widely seen by political scientists as the gold standard for how you get laws to work, can actually backfire by making it harder for old agreements to apply to new and unprecedented things. And so I've got three goals for the time we've got in the talk today. First, I'll show how more and more specificity, which almost everyone recommends, isn't really the one-size-fits-all solution it's made out to be, and that it can actually make laws weaker rather than stronger. And second, I'll give you some evidence in two parts. First, I'll introduce a new kind of experiment that I did And that's the part I'll spend the most time on. But then I'll also talk about historical case studies to show how these things really work in the real world. And the takeaway from all this is that even though international law might be what powerful states say it is, even powerful states often feel constrained about what they can say. And this kind of affects the options states actually have when it comes to managing these technological challenges. And then finally, to conclude, I'll try to make a case for why this is important for cooperation between the US and China over emerging technologies, especially those with security implications, and what we can hopefully learn from all this. Now in political science, questions about what makes legal norms work are often conflated with questions about what makes them last. And this is how the usual story goes. By signing on to international laws, states signal their intentions not to deviate from a certain set of behaviors. And they do that by locking in institutional rules that sort of reflect the distribution of power. And so, if nothing ever changes, everyone is sort of operating in this environment. But technological innovation can later disrupt that balance and make institutions seem less advantageous to at least one side. And so dissatisfied states can then exploit ambiguities in the law to sort of evade the commitments that they made in previous periods while claiming that they're still technically in compliance. And so this tension between the compromises states make and the changes to their interests is really inevitable. And so the question is, how do we build laws that are actually resilient to this? So longstanding theory holds that laws are more effective when they're more specific. And the logic behind this is pretty intuitive, right? When the law is not specific, it's less useful as a benchmark. And if we can't tell what the law says, what's the point of even having it? So the idea is, you make laws as specific as possible, and you don't have to worry as much about ambiguity. And this has really led to two corollary literatures. So first, states know their interests are going to change someday. And so in order to get them to sign on in the first place, the recommendation has always been to sacrifice other elements of the law, like maybe you allow reservations or you build in sunset clauses before you jeopardize this kind of specificity that's inherent to the law. Because once you jeopardize specificity, you soften these agreements and you make them vulnerable to exploitation. And this is really in the cornerstone of these well-established literatures on soft law and flexibility provisions and IR theory, on policy discretion and the study of legislative and judicial politics, and even contract theory and economics. Now, a second corollary literature on technological determinism has argued that, since the only constant is change, not even the best laws can keep up. And so the only way forward is basically to keep legislating our way out of the problem. And I think, this works pretty well in a lot of domestic situations, but in international relations, status quo defenders might cling to old configurations, and revisionists might refuse to come back to the bargaining table. And so updates tend to be kind of a costly proposition. And so together, these are really our leading theories in the study of law and technology. You can find both sets of arguments being advanced separately in top political science journals like the APSR. And also, if you look at the negotiating track record, this emphasis on specificity is very common among states in practice. Governments hire armies of lawyers to write and interpret their legal commitments. This is true for both the US and China. And there's been this continual push in the US since at least the 1970s to make agreements between the US and other countries more specific and more comprehensive. And so far, this logic is pretty compelling, right? So it's kind of worth illustrating how it works. So imagine we're lawmakers and we want to sit down, we want to write something like the Chemical Weapons Convention. Well, depending on how much paper and time we have to sit down and write this agreement, we can either isolate and specifically include just the items we want to regulate. And so this is what the convention does, and here's some actual language from it. Or we can write a really general law that simply refers to the family to which those things belong. Now, this is a lot easier, which is why sometimes we end up with it. But as you can imagine, there are some serious downsides, right? We might accidentally exclude some things we meant to include if they're outliers in some way, or include things we meant to exclude. Maybe we wanted to exempt them for some reason. And also, there's just a lot of borderline cases where people might genuinely disagree on what belongs to which category. So, especially maybe there are translation difficulties between Chinese and English or another language. So it would seem that if we can get specific laws, we should always go with that. Conversely, I'm going to argue that this relationship really only holds under an assumption we know on its face has to be false, and that is when designers can see into the future. So by see the future, I mean anticipate unexpected events. But almost all models of international contracting, they recognize that states bargain under uncertainty about the future, but they also sort of assume states know the shape of that uncertainty and can take it into account. And in contrast, right, we know that the world is defined by unknown unknowns, what the economist Frank Knight has defined as unquantifiable risk, or others have called black swan events. And this is precisely what disruptive technology does, right? It's basically it's the difference between not yet knowing how much you can expect to benefit from a technology versus it having some uncontemplated uses, or maybe its very existence not having been discovered yet. And so how do things work when we relax the standard assumption that states can always see beyond the technology frontier? Well, assume some new technological capability is introduced, and here it'll be the X in red. Well, a very specific law that works by exhaustively enumerating every contingency by definition, it can't include something that it never anticipated, right? Even if that thing is physically very similar to other things that are already on the list. And in contrast, a more generalized law at least has a positive probability of doing so, even if it's kind of debatable. And so there are some nice empirical implications from this that we can actually go out and test. This logical specificity assumes the static universe of possibilities, and it predicts that specificity leads to strictly better coverage and thus better compliance. And under this framework, law's effect depends entirely on how it's written, and technology is really irrelevant. And then there's this literature on technology alongside a lot of popular wisdom that argues that specificity is at least never worse, right? Since how laws are written is really irrelevant. Technology alone is the sufficient reason why laws become obsolete. In contrast, I argue that specificity and technology are actually interactive. And so in the model that I'm advancing, some generality in law, despite some associated ambiguity, is precisely what gives it its staying power. And so what's happening here is the specificity might perform well in the near term, but it's really too rigid to guide us as the world undergoes change. And even if generality comes with some ambiguity, ambiguity cuts both ways. So states that are concerned with maintaining even the veneer of compliance have to worry about the strength of opposing arguments too. And so take it together, if I'm right, what this prediction means is we should see general laws performing weakly better the more unusual technology becomes since the time a law was written. Now, there's a reason this hasn't been done before. So first, international law is just rife with selection issues. It's very rare for two laws to cover the exact same thing and just vary in specificity. And states only sign on to agreements they think they're willing to comply with in the first place, as we know. Second, how do we know specificity when we see it? So much of the existing work on this in the social sciences has been formal theoretical. And so other than a few attempts, there's not a whole lot of good precedent for actually how to measure specificity. And then third, with very few exceptions, political scientists haven't really asked how the lawyers that states hire to make these determinations tend to think and behave. And so if we could randomize the law, then we can get around the first set of issues. So that's what I do. I developed this hybrid survey experiment that treats long form, highly detailed text as a primary dependent variable. And since we're asking about language, why not ask the experts? And so that's what I do. I devise and operationalize a new measure for specificity by drawing on first principles from psycholinguistics theory, which as far as I can tell has never been tested empirically like this. And then finally, we're going to ask real legal professionals to see what they think. And so the scenario in this experiment that I'm going to talk about is there's this game-changing military satellite technology that only one country can build, and questions have been raised about whether it's legal or not. And we're going to ask legal experts to tell us whether they think it's banned or not under a hypothetical international treaty called the Orbital Convention. And then to measure this, we're going to vary three treatment factors. So we're going to vary the specificity of the law they're working with. We're going to vary the novelty of the technology that they're confronted with. And then we're also going to vary the policy priorities of the boss to whom they're reporting. And so, we're interested in what the people who are hired to read these laws for the government think. And so to populate the study, I commissioned a sample of elite law students and graduates who are headed into national security law careers. And I'm arguing here that young lawyers are really the ideal sampling frame. Yes, they're young, but it also means that they understand technology better. And the only difference between the people coming out of elite law schools and the seasoned legal professionals they'll eventually become is, knowledge of particular laws and hands-on experience. And so since the law here is entirely hypothetical, knowledge really shouldn't matter. And recent research in the APSR suggests that experience might not matter either. And so I fielded this with help from Columbia University's National Security Law Society, which maintains this closed listserv to Columbia Law upper level students and graduates who are kind of working in international and national security law spheres. And I can tell you that they took this very seriously. They paid very close attention to detail. The median participant spent between 1 and 2 hours on it, wrote several pages of detailed, highly structured text in response. The max was something like 14,000 words, which is close to 30 single-space pages. And many of them even wrote in character based on the role that they were assigned. And so I think we can be sure that they really kind of did, internalize this, take it seriously, and write persuasive answers. And so this is what the sample looked like. Essentially, it's what we'd expect from a top 4 law school. They're well-trained, they're highly qualified, they're very high-performing. They're interested in science and technology, but not a whole lot of knowledge other than what they're shown in these reports. This is much like some of the experts I interviewed during my fieldwork. And in terms of the implementation, didn't encounter any problems, but if anyone has questions about how I actually did this, I'm happy to return to this in the Q&A so we can kind of go over the methodological details. So let me be clear about what I'm doing here, since there's a lot of moving parts in this design. We want to make this an easy test for existing theory and a hard test for this new proposition that I'm advancing. And so there are 3 treatments here, and each is intended to test how specificity and technology are interacting with political incentives. So here we're going to, first we're going to draw on this linguistics literature to vary the specificity of this legal benchmarks they're working with. And so half see a more general version of this orbital convention. This is on the left in blue. And if existing theory is right and specificity is always better, then ambiguity in words like high, right, which is basically just a judgment call, should permit some cheating among opportunists who have an incentive to bend the law to get what they want, right? The other half see a more specific version, and this is on the right in red, where words like center point become cemented in more precise terms like planetary barycenter, and words like high actually get defined on a specific mathematical range. And then this process is going to be iterated across keywords in 4 operative provisions of this treaty. So the list goes on. And second, we want to know whether a disruptive technology is going to be too much for either version of this treaty to handle. And so as a benchmark, half see what looks a lot like a conventional satellite, but then the other half sees, a more radical version that basically on paper does all the same things, but also adds some new dimensions that the law is technically silent about. And if you look at it, right, it's basically questionable whether it's even a satellite anymore. Now, there are important reasons why I chose, these particular technologies. For example, one nice property is that satellites have both market and security implications. But the fact that it's a satellite doesn't really matter for our purposes. All we care about is how different the 2 satellites are from each other on these relative dimensions under the orbital convention. And then finally, the third thing is we want to know if actors who have an interest in kind of defecting from their earlier agreements are going to evade their treaty obligations when there's some latent ambiguity that they can exploit. And so half are told to make the best case they can on behalf of a country that has strong interests in seeing this technology permitted so that it can be deployed. And so taken together, right, if I'm right, this more revolutionary technology is going to start to water down the applicability of the law, but the specific version should actually be more sensitive to this and not less, like existing theory predicts. Now, here's the first set of statistical results. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to kind of walk you through how this works. So the columns here represent kind of the futurism of the technology. As we move from left to right, it's getting more futuristic. And the rows represent the specificity of the legal benchmarks they're working with. And then there's 2 dotted lines here, right? The further right the estimates are from the dotted line, the stronger the restrictive interpretation. So in other words, the more likely someone is to argue that the satellite's banned by the convention. And so this is nothing fancy, right? This is literally just a difference in means. So the first thing to notice is that on the top row, where subjects saw this specific version of the text, we can see how sensitive this text was to technological change, right? We go from very strong support for a ban under this more ordinary technology to very weak support for the more revolutionary version. And already we see theory about specificity failing the test, right? Even the most specific law is no match for a sufficiently novel technology. But I think the real test comes on the bottom row in this more generalized condition. So here we see that technological change is also downshifting interpretations, but these interpretations are far less sensitive to the exact same technological disruption. So this is really a direct refutation of this common wisdom that no law is a match for disruptive technology. Maybe the general law here isn't crystal clear, but on average, it's still pretty restrictive. And whether it's an old technology or a new technology doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. Now, in this condition, we might be worried about ambiguity, right? Because the idea is that opportunists should be able to exploit it. Well, actually, in the experiment, we don't find any statistically significant difference between how different types of advisors behave depending on what their motivations were, and only a really tiny substantive difference. And if you actually read their answers, the logic here is lawyers who work for the state that can gain from the technology, they might want to help their bosses get out of this if they can, but they just honestly can't bring themselves to justify that decision in open argument because they know it won't be persuasive to a skeptical audience. And so, in a sense, they are advancing their country's interests, but they're doing so by protecting their bosses from being exposed to allegations of non-compliance. And so if such a state did want to evade its obligations, but it's sensitive to the appearance of cheating, then it would probably prefer to keep its activities secret because mounting a good legal defense in the open here is just impossible. Now, an innovation of this particular design is that we're collecting these long-form free responses, and subjects are kind of writing essays that walk us through their reasoning process step by step. And so we can actually process trace their decision-making chain and kind of the rationale for reasoning these certain ways. And as I'll show you in a second, this can lead to some surprising discoveries. Now, it's too long to show an entire brief. As I mentioned, they wrote many pages in response, but here are some representative excerpts among subjects who saw the more futuristic satellite. So blue is an argument that the technology is prohibited, red is why it's permitted. And we can see that these arguments tended to focus on the scope of keywords. So the emphasis really was all on whether the language was broad enough or too narrow to apply. And unbeknownst to the subjects, right, this was in fact the treatment. So I think we can kind of take this as powerful evidence that specificity is really doing the majority of heavy lifting here and not technology. Now, they also tended to acknowledge that if the law was too specific, it would need to be formally updated in order to have any effect. But updates, as we know, in IR are kind of a high bar. Political capital has to be marshaled. Not everyone might be on board. For example, a country that thinks it can gain an edge is unlikely to make concessions. And this is exactly what happened in the Novichok case, right? The Chemical Weapons Convention was so clear that Russia was able to invent a new technology just to get around it. And in response, the US, Canada, Netherlands, other countries motion for a ban. Russia counters with its own proposal. And after kind of a year of back and forth concessions, we finally end up with this kind of watered down version that bans some types of Novichok but not others. And so updating it was arguably a lot harder than simply analogizing it would have been. Now, a cool thing about this design is the data I collected can be mined to uncover additional causal mechanisms, for example, how specificity shapes policy advice at the cognitive level. So most survey research, kind of the important parameters are predefined by the questions, and subjects are merely asked to rate their agreement up or down with those questions, right? So here I'm not doing any of that. I'm not imposing any dimensionality in this problem. I'm giving them a hypothetical, and I'm basically asking them, okay, you tell me why you think the law applies or not, what's dispositive to that argument. And so this is really an ideal opportunity for unsupervised text discovery. And so here I'm using a machine learning technique called a structural topic model that's been popularized in recent years. It allows me to identify the union of all the different arguments that the lawyers who saw the more futuristic version tended to make. And I'm using an optimization technique here to isolate 9 reasons that they all tended to have in common. So the x-axis here represents the percent change in how prevalent each of those 9 themes were in the average argument. In other words, what subjects tended to emphasize as they moved from more general language to more specific language. And I think the most interesting finding, without dwelling on this for too long, is captured between topics 5 and 8. So here we can see that both groups, they saw the exact same futuristic technology, but only lawyers who are working from this more specific version of the treaty text volunteered observations about how radically different that technology seemed to be from ordinary satellites. And to me, what this means is, okay, we understand the nature of a technology through the prism of whatever our expertise is. And for legal experts, this is language. And so if decision makers are delegating these decisions to legal advisors, but for those advisors, specificity constrains the range of plausible analogies they can make between past and present, then advisors aren't going to just recommend a more restrained policy option. They're actually going to shape the overall menu of options, because the most unreasonable recommendations may not even occur to them at the cognitive level. And so I'm going to push further on this, but just to recap, what we found in the experiment, the strong support for this argument that what makes law work is not necessarily the same thing as what makes it last. And as hypothesized, right, the specificity seems to work well for the current world, but generality is kind of nice if we want to avoid costly renegotiation when things change, which they inevitably do. I think it goes to show that even if international law is what states say it is, states listen to their legal experts, and these legal experts don't always think that they're completely free to say anything they want. And so how do these ideas help explain current events? For the second part of the talk, let's move away from this experiment, and let's turn back to this FOBs example that we opened up with in the beginning of the talk. So we want to know why the US government, which has no FOBs of its own, hasn't alleged a Chinese violation of the Outer Space Treaty. And so we can learn a lot about this case from history. So just 18 days after the Outer Space Treaty went into force, US intelligence confirmed that the Soviet Union had tested a very similar technology. And at that time, there were serious interagency disagreements within the US government about whether this technology violated the treaty. Ultimately, the US ends up taking the exact same restrained approach to its competitor back then. And so this raises a question again for us. Why did the US government not seize the opportunity to slow or at least embarrass its adversaries both then and now? Well, I went to the archives to figure this out for my dissertation, and I've got a case on this that I'm developing for my book. What I found was that the US was basically caught between 2 bad options, right? First, it could do nothing, and it could let the Soviets gain this material advantage, which at the time was actually considered quite threatening. Or, it could challenge the Soviets under the treaty. But since the US had actually been the one to push for specific outer space treaty language that emphasized permanence in space, so in other words, kind of multiple orbits, then challenging a temporary orbit now wouldn't be seen by other parties to the treaty as credible. And so cognizant of these trade-offs, President Johnson was persuaded not to accuse the Soviets of any wrongdoing. And then in early November, when the press got wind of it, the Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert McNamara, was put in the ignominious position of actually defending the Soviets' right to use a technology that the US didn't have. And so the US had no choice but to pursue formal negotiations beginning in 1968. And it ends up having to make pretty serious concessions to get the Soviets to give it up during the strategic arms limitation talks, the second round of those. But SALT II never went into force, and China wasn't a party to it anyway. And so now that China is acquiring a comparable technology, really back full circle. And in fact, shortly after reports broke, I spoke to someone at the State Department's Bureau of Arms Control Verification and Compliance, who confirmed for me that the US government basically has no plans to challenge the legality of what China is doing either, and quoted McNamara's justification to me about the scope of treaty language almost verbatim. So it goes back to the same question we started the talk with. When adversaries do things with technology that seems questionable, why don't we always see a response? And the answer is that the specificity of the law is what's binding the hands of decision makers in all these cases. And meanwhile, in other cases where the rules were a little less narrowly specified, innovators were more easily pressured into giving up their newfound capabilities. So had the Chemical Weapons Convention or the Outer Space Treaty been a little less specific. Things might not have been perfect, right? We might have had other problems, but at least it would have been harder for states to argue that their actions were perfectly legal and this sort of mere linguistic technicality. Okay, so this helps explain the US government's perspective, but what about China? So like the US, China's leadership definitely recognizes the importance of having effective lawyers as a tool of statecraft. And just like his predecessors, Xi Jinping has made a renewed push for more legal expertise in China's foreign policy establishment. But lawyers don't always play the same role or get the same training in every country. And kind of the biggest divides are between authoritarian countries and democracies on one hand, or between common law countries and civil law countries on the other. And the US and China both lie right on this fault line. And so law works really differently in Marxist-Leninist systems in particular. And in fact, for most of its history, the PRC didn't have a legal profession at all. So when it first took over, the CCP tried to repurpose this cadre of international lawyers and legal academics that it inherited from the old regime under a kind of Soviet-style model. But then these lawyers ended up taking the brunt of the anti-rightist struggles and were further decimated during the Cultural Revolution. And by the time it opened to the West, by some estimates, there were only a few hundred people left in China with any legal training at all. Almost none of that was in international law. And interestingly, and I'm not sure if this is common knowledge, it certainly wasn't to me, but the US continued to engage in sustained arms control dialogue with China throughout the 1950s and 60s. I found records of at least 128 meetings in Warsaw, during which some actual concrete proposals were exchanged. So for example, in 1963, Zhou Enlai's representatives privately conveyed a set of disarmament proposals to JFK and said that they hoped that the US government would respond favorably. Later on, the US government responded with some of its own offers, like being able to join the NPT despite not having recognition, or maybe the opportunity to explore limited test ban treaty signatures in exchange for some kind of bilateral no first use agreement. But even though China had gone nuclear in 1964, the US was really fundamentally reluctant to bring their PRC into these formal nuclear discussions, especially at SALT, in part because it thought that Beijing's lack of legal expertise and therefore its emphasis on propaganda meant that it would end up blowing up these multilateral talks. And in fact, this was actually offered up as an advantage when it came to talks that the US didn't like. So the US maybe wanted those talks to blow up, but it couldn't appear to be frontally opposed to them. So by the time the US was ready to start seriously involving China, the Sino-Soviet split had come to a head, and Moscow is now objecting to any inclusion of China in the SALT exchanges. And it was really doing everything it could, including privately conveying some pretty racist rhetoric to get Nixon to go back to this old stance of ostracizing Beijing. But throughout this period, while this is going on, the documents I found described Chinese leadership as kind of hungry to learn more, and it recognized that developing legal expertise is not only going to help China modernize, but it's actually going to help it advance its interests abroad in a more effective way. And so the US and others ended up sending legal experts like Jerry Cohen and Stanley Lubman to China to help it rapidly rebuild its legal system. And China today has a robust legal profession, certainly unique in many ways, but also spiked with US influence. And so in recent years, the PLA has written about the actual and potential utility of what it calls legal warfare for advancing Chinese interests in the South China Sea. And I'm not convinced this is fundamentally different from how the US has practiced international law, but the concept has led to a lot of cynicism about how China can weaponize its newfound international legal capabilities to corrupt existing regimes. And on the one hand, there really isn't an empirical reason to suspect that that the psychology of these legal advisors in China is systematically different than it is in the West. There's this enormous literature in sociology that basically concludes that the main differences in how these lawyers behave is structural. So the kind of the role the lawyers play in the system is what matters. And what this means is, how China ends up behaving in the foreign policy space on these types of issues depends not only on how good its lawyers are, but whether they're consulted, whether they can advance unsolicited opinions, and how seriously their advice is taken. So in other words, where they are in the organizational hierarchy and how much influence they're given. And so if Beijing is serious about increasing its legal capacity, it's going to have to more closely involve its legal advisors in the foreign policy decision-making process. But just like what happens in the US, China's leadership isn't always going to like the advice its lawyers come back with. And so on the other hand, if Beijing doesn't involve them, it's only hurting itself, because interpretations have to seem credible to be taken seriously by other countries. And so moving forward, the US is going to have to engage China on these technology issues. Getting everyone off the competition treadmill is often cheaper and safer than kind of plowing forward, especially for countries that are already in the lead. And so we should want to know what strategies states have at their disposal to accomplish that. Of course, on nuclear issues in particular, since China wasn't invited to SALT when those talks were first happening, in some ways we're working from square one. So bargaining from scratch is often harder than adapting this existing language, as we saw from the experiment. But the benefits of arms control for countries aren't purely strategic, right? Sometimes they're political. Being involved in talks and signing these agreements signals that you're part of the club, that you've made it, that you have status. And the US recognized this as a major concern for the Soviets throughout the 1970s. And the language decision makers used about the Soviets then is very similar to the language we see about how what the US thinks about what China wants today. So finding a way to balance everyone's strategic considerations, that's going to be hard, right? But I think if the two countries manage to engage when things were at their worst, they can certainly try to engage on these issues now. And moreover, although China isn't involved in as much arms control as the US is, it is a member of a number of major agreements. So it's party to a number of limitations agreements. It's also party to several export control regimes, and it's involved in all the ongoing talks around cyber, AI, and space. And it's also pushing for new agreements. So, for example, the prevention of the placement on weapons in outer space, often called the PPWT. The US side tends to laugh this off as kind of way too sweeping in general. And for all the usual reasons, right? There's long been the suspicion that countries only propose general language because they plan on violating it. But the US has traditionally been the technology first mover in these areas. And an alternative interpretation is that countries are proposing this general language when they worry that the US is simply trying to lock them in and leave them behind with specific language. And so there are some major problems with current proposals. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily in bad faith, though. And I think general agreements are sometimes the only ones we can get. And the research here shows that they actually do pretty well, all things considered. So as we consider how to move forward, whether it's negotiating new agreements or finding ways to apply old ones, both sides might do better to consider, how they can make generality work for them. And so just to sum up the talk, military technology creates winners and losers almost by definition, but only some technologies ever become controversial. And I think this work that I'm doing helps explain why. On the one hand, there's this widespread belief that we can only get what we want through specificity, and on the other, that only technology matters. And each of these leads to a paradox if we follow them to their logical conclusions, right? And in fact, scholars and thinkers of law and technology should really be talking to each other a whole lot more than they already do. And this is a theme that runs through my research agenda. And I think this has implications for how we understand why arms control seems so useless lately, right? There's been this continual push for more and more specificity in international law and arms control in recent decades, even as the pace of technology has also quickened. And the evidence here suggests that all this work might be counterproductive if it actually undermines the staying power of those institutions in the first place. And so finally, stability is a priority for us. Ambiguity isn't always the worst thing. So for states that value the status quo, uncertainty about whether the law applies can be better than certainty that it definitely does not apply. And I think arms controllers in the early years kind of understood their purpose a little bit differently, right? Rather than coming out of the gates with these complicated, specific, verifiable agreements, which are hard to negotiate anyway, the idea was kind of to lay these principled foundations which could evolve along with technology. And so I think we should remain open to these principled agreements if they provide a starting place from which we can figure out what interests we all have in common, even if we can't agree on everything right away. And so with that, thanks so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to any questions or comments you might have for me. Thanks so much.
Oops. Thanks, Justin. Oh, you took the screen share down. That's good. So I'm hoping that people will put their questions in the Q&A. I've asked Justin a lot of questions relatively recently about his work because he made the very similar excellent presentation in Indiana at our annual conference just earlier this month. So I have a couple of new questions for him. I have a lot of questions for him, obviously, because we've been reading his work so carefully and listening to his presentation so carefully. But I hope that others will chime in with questions. And I'll just start by asking something about a recent event and whether your research says anything about it. And the recent event was last week. Vice President Harris made a speech in which she said that the United States would stop testing anti-satellite weapons so that the United States could more credibly forward the notion of a rule-based international order. And I'm wondering what you think about what she's referring to. In other words, what is banned? What treaty or agreement bans land-based anti-satellite weapons tests? I know they're frowned upon. I remember when I was in the government in January 2007, and China blew up a low Earth orbit satellite with a ground-based anti-satellite weapon and significantly increased the amount of space debris that was in the low Earth orbit belt, which has real implications for commercial satellites and other things. So it was widely criticized as unnecessary, provocative, and badly executed, like the trifecta, not just by the United States, by multiple countries. But I'm not sure if you could make a legal argument that China broke a treaty that it had signed by doing so. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering what your interpretation of Vice President Harris's statement is. What is she trying to avoid doing, or what example is she trying to set? And can those kind of abstract examples be set if the real purpose is to prevent China or Russia or some other country from testing anti-satellite weapons in the future? And in any way, does that relate to your research design? As soon as I saw that news, I have to say I was a little surprised by it. Mm-hmm. And I also instantly thought of your thesis. So that's a good thing.
No, do you want to respond to that right away?
Yeah. I hope others will chime in with questions. Oh, I see one coming. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I won't spend too much time on it then. So I want to get to other questions.
No, spend time on it. It's a new one.
This is great.
Yeah, in Indiana because I didn't know in Indiana that this was going to happen. So.
Yeah. Well, this really surprised me too. And I'm not necessarily an expert on space, but I think these kind of cases of kind of unilateral disarmament are really interesting, right? So in some cases, I think they can actually work, right? I think the moratorium on nuclear testing in the 1950s that was briefly pursued kind of set the stage for the limited test ban treaty. And although it didn't last, right, it kind of signaled that countries may actually be willing to cooperate in this area. So this space arms control thing is interesting because the U.S. and the Soviet Union had an opportunity to pursue anti-satellite talks in the 1970s, 1980s, and briefly considered them. And pretty much the U.S. ended up being the one to shoot that down. And the stated reason, and often the reason that comes across is that it's impossible to distinguish between satellites that are out there to defend against ballistic missiles and satellites that are there to attack other satellites or attack other assets. So on the one hand, the ASATs are extremely useful. They're hard to distinguish, so countries have incentives not to give them up, especially in this this world of highly network-centric warfare, right? But they're also terrible for the environment. They're really destabilizing, and there's no existing agreement out there that could conceivably cover them, right? So the Outer Space Treaty is only for things that are stationed in space. It was very specific about that, and it's very specific about only covering nuclear weapons. And so since the mid-1980s, there were some talks in the UN going on to kind of extend those rules. They dissolved in the mid-90s and then they started back up again after the 2000s. And those talks have been consistently resisted by the US. And I think the US was one of the only UN members not to vote yes on formalizing these talks a few years ago. And then the Chinese and Russian proposal, the PPWT, kind of grew out of these talks. I think it was originally introduced back in 2010, and it used language that China had been advancing in a working paper for several years prior, and that gave way to another group of governmental experts that began talking about these issues too. So there's all these parallel talks going on. The U.S. Considered the Chinese proposal back in, I think, 1998 or something. It was a long time ago that they ran this in-depth review, and it continues to rely on the same in-depth review that's pretty old. And kind of the stated reason for that, for not considering the proposal, is that it's really impossible to kind of define space weapons to distinguish offensive from defensive weapons. But so that's why I think this is really surprising to see Vice President Harris and kind of unilaterally renounce ASATs, at least temporarily, right? So,
but the ASATs she's talking about are not space-based weapons, right? They're ground-based weapons that attack satellites, right? So, that wasn't covered by outer space weapons conventions in any case. I mean, there are rules against space-based weapons, but a ground-based weapon that hits a satellite is not a space-based weapon, right?
Yeah, and that's a limitation of the PPWT proposal too. The Chinese proposal is that they're basically porting in language from the Outer Space Treaty so it's already like politically palatable language from this old treaty, which itself ported from the Antarctica Treaty. So this language has basically just been lifted from treaty to treaty, even as technology has changed. And they're only broadening it to include conventional weapons that are in space. So you still got this specific requirement about permanence in space. And so the FOBS test is not going to be covered by that. Ground-based anti-satellite weapons are not covered by that. So, what the U.S. could do is counterpropose a treaty that does include those things, right? And there's reasons maybe why the U.S. doesn't want it to cover those things, which we can get into, which I think makes the unilateral enunciation kind of even more surprising, right? So what the U.S. wants in this space is these non-binding norms. The U.S. and the U.K. have been pushing that for a while now, and certainly putting a moratorium on ASAT launches is voluntary, right? And the U.S. could withdraw that if it wants to. So maybe that's the idea, is that it does add credibility, but it gives us flexibility in the same way.
But it's kind of non-binding norm setting through action. So it is abstract. It's not very specific. So it fits into your broad approach of using reputation rather than very specific legalisms. The problem with it on a technical level, you can talk about that in a session like this, is there are other technologies that could be called anti-satellite weapons that have nothing to do with performing or not performing ASAT tests. And one of them is missile defense. If you can hit a ballistic missile in outer space from the ground, you can certainly hit a satellite, which comes over on a scheduled rotation with an anti-missile with a missile defense system. And the other is maneuverable satellites. For a whole range of reasons, you want to be able to maneuver modern satellites, ironically, in part to get out of the debris field that might be coming its way, that the Chinese helped create in January 2007. But if you can maneuver a satellite, you can turn the satellite into a weapon, because you can maneuver one satellite into another satellite. I mean, it's a kamikaze weapon in a sense as satellites go, but it could do damage to a chosen satellite. So I just wonder, I am puzzled by it. I'll just say I was puzzled by the announcement, and I'm not really sure what behaviors they expect other countries to change, but maybe they're adopting your logic of we should make a broad statement about anti-satellite weapons being bad, consistent with some pre-existing norm, and we can add some weight to that by stopping these types of tests ourselves, and hope that others will follow suit.
So my reaction to that is maybe it's not a good case of what I'm talking about. It's a case where language that's too broad could end up capturing all the wrong things. So if we have a broad prohibition without any exceptions in it, we can end up like eliminating BMD, which of course the U.S. government's not willing to do. It's off the table. And also maneuverable satellites, which is, as you say, necessary, right? So these are things we don't want to end up eliminating. So using broad language, using specific language is actually a nice way to carve out exceptions for those things. And I think the same thing happened during the Outer Space Treaty, right? So the reason that the U.S. government was pushing for this specific language was because it didn't want to end up accidentally including ICBMs, right? Like it didn't want, like those go into space, but they don't enter orbit. They don't stay up there. So part of what it was trying to do is make sure that ICBMs, which are they're nuclear, right, don't end up getting covered accidentally by language that's overly broad. And same thing with the precursor to the space shuttle, right, the dinosaur. It was basically a hypersonic bomber. We didn't want that being covered either. And the orbit that it would complete would be fractional, right? So these are all reasons why we didn't want the Outer Space Treaty to be broad, but that ended up causing us problems in ways that we didn't anticipate. And so the same thing could happen here.
Okay, so there's a question asking you to discuss the potential unintended consequences of, what's the proper term, ambiguous agreements, especially in cybersecurity. And it's addressed to you and to me. It's your show, so it's addressed to you.
So is there a way I could read the question? Because I'm not quite sure.
It's in the Q&A. It's from someone with your last name.
Okay, well, I guess this better be good then. So
it's a good question.
If you can't find it, I can read it to you verbatim.
No, this is good. I found it. So,
okay.
Yeah, I think this is the well. This is the thing. We really haven't had any agreements in cyber, and often the reason cited for that is the technology moving too quickly, that we don't understand it enough, that it's impossible to kind of count or observe. But I think that's a nice. I mean, this is an avenue for kind of general language, right? It's a if we use language that's all encompassing, maybe that can help eliminate some of the ambiguity rather than introducing ambiguity. But it's a very it's a kind of a very general answer to your question, but I think maybe it could be a starting
point.
But
if you use general language, what's the potential downside as opposed to specific language? Because you seem to favor general language. That's the counterintuitive part of your thesis. Most people like specific language. You, Justin, like general language because general language is more flexible and is more able to absorb new technologies that weren't anticipated at the time that the treaty was drawn. Now you're facing cyber. How specific do you want to be, and how much does it depend on the situation that you're trying to control?
So first, I should preface this by saying that the argument I'm making is not a normative argument. I'm not saying that generality is the social good that we should all be pushing for, but it is maybe something we should consider if we value the status quo, right? And we're in this world where things move quickly and unpredictably, which is exactly what's happening in cyberspace, right? So if the reason we can't get agreements in cyber is partly because the technology is moving too quickly, and so any sort of specific limitations we write in are going to change the next day, then this is an opportunity to use kind of more general kind of broad prohibitions that could last over time. But yeah, I don't have specific recommendations about like what a cyber treaty should look like, because this is a very complicated area, and this is it's been going on a long time. So I think partly maybe cyber doesn't lend itself to these types of things because it's not really about the technology itself, but it's about like what you do with the technology. So rather than kind of treating this as like in the realm of arms control, where usually you're limiting things that you can count, right? It's more of kind of like Geneva law, where you're regulating behaviors or something like that. And I think that's what the group of governmental experts in cyber and these parallel talks at the OEWG have really been pushing, is kind of like responsibility not to do certain things with this technology.
Okay, I'm sending you a message in the chat just to you, and you can look at it and decide what you want to do. There it is.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's up to you. I'm not pressing. It's your call, because sometimes it's a recent dissertation. You may not want to talk about that aspect, or.
Yeah, so part of what I wanted to do is to try to figure out how lawyers in China understand their role, and so not identical work that I've done for my dissertation or for the book that you saw in the talk, but just trying to understand how kind of like legal education in China has changed over the years, and in what ways it's similar to U.S. legal education, in what ways it's different, and how that kind of shapes the way that lawyers think about these issues. And so not just legal advisors in the foreign policy establishment, but lawyers in general in China, how they kind of understand what their role is vis-a-vis their clients or their bosses. And so I've been trying to run surveys in China for a number of years now. First, my first plan was to run this on a Fulbright when I had a Fulbright to Fudan Dashue in 2019, and of course that was cut short by the pandemic, so I didn't have a chance to do it. And now the research climate is a little bit more difficult, and so it's questionable whether I'll be able to do that. But there is a wide literature in sociology that does this already that we can learn from a little bit in the meantime, which is nice.
Okay, great. I'm kind of out of questions. I could pretend that I never asked you questions 2 weeks ago, and ask them again, but I don't want to do that because it seems artificial. I don't see anybody else in the Q&A queue. So if that's the case, I may just call it a night and thank you for your presentation, which I found to be particularly concise. It was even more professionally put together than your last one, which was professionally put together. So way to go. And that's our last, this is again our last session for the year. For those of you who are here and have been to all of the talks, I know there's some names on there that have been to almost every talk. Thank you for attending, and thanks again to Daniel for putting this all together. And we'll see you in the fall for a new round of talks and a new set of fellows for China and the World. We have 3 new fellows coming in. We're excited about it, and we'll continue to build the community. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, Justin.